Welcome to Surreal Noir. I'm your host, Kate Laity.
You know Dix didn't do it. You saw him after the girl left.
But Lockman has a different idea. He believes Dix could have done it. I left his office feeling as though he were trying to warn me. I came here because I wanted to say these things out loud and be laughed at. But you're not laughing.
That was a clip from the 1950 film, In a Lonely Place, based on the novel by Dorothy Hughes. And here we have the glorious Gloria Graham and Jeff Donnell, born Jean Marie, talking about a situation that is not unusual in noir film. A woman's fear that a man is going to do her harm, or someone harm. Dangerous men and desperate women. That's at the heart of noir. That and a lot of dark ambiance. Chiaroscuro lighting. Heavy darks and blinding whites, and a morality that is every shade of gray. I tend to think of noir films as a place where desperate people make difficult decisions, and usually the wrong ones. There doesn't tend to be a lot of hope, but there does tend to be a huge criminal ambiance. And anything that can go wrong probably will. What does this have to do with surreal? Well, they're both French movements. Although most of the classic films noir are American, it took French film critics to sit down and come up with a genre. A little bit of retcon, if you know the comics term, retroactive continuity. The people making these films did not see themselves as making noir. Many of them were making B-pictures or crime films, and it was only afterward that these film critics looked back on this body of work, most of it from the World War II or the immediate post-war period, and took a look at the things they had in common. A lot of these hastily made films were not made to last, and yet many of them do. The artistry involved has a lot to do with that, but also that they're appealing to something very evocative across, certainly Western culture. If it's anything to judge by, film noir has its fans in the East as well. There are certainly a lot of Hong Kong films that have taken up a noir ambiance, and a lot of the early films of Kurosawa were definitely noir. One of the key identifiers for these French film critics of the noir film was the femme fatale, the dangerous, the fatal woman. But in recent years, film scholars have questioned whether that's really a central image or just one that they really latched onto. An awful lot of noir films don't have a femme fatale. It helps to remember that in France, it wasn't until 1944 that women were allowed to vote. In 1949, Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex, in which she said, "One is not born, but one becomes a woman." That is to say, you're shaped by how society sees you. The surrealists were fascinated by the femme enfant, the infant woman, the childlike woman, the Alice in Wonderland figure. I'm mostly interested in the female surrealists, particularly Leonora Carrington, Remedios Varo, and Leonora Fini. Leonora Carrington is famous for saying, "I didn't have time to be anybody's muse." and she did not respond to the desire to position her as the femme enfant. Very fascinating life. At an early age, well, after being thrown out of many schools and being forced into becoming a debutante, one of her most well-known stories, she ran off at the age of 19 to Paris to become an artist at the side of Max Ernst, who was many years her senior. She was cut off from her family and for a time lived the free life she had always wanted, being an artist, creating, painting, doing all kinds of things, writing. And then, of course, the war came. Max Ernst was taken to a camp. As a German living in France, he was seen as an enemy combatant for a time. He was released, but then he was taken away again. And around this time, Leonora Carrington was convinced by her friends to flee from France and make their way south to Spain and then to Portugal so that they could escape. If you've seen Casablanca, you know how Portugal is the gateway out of Europe at this time. What happened to her on that journey? Terrified, wondering what would happen to her partner, Max, not knowing where she was headed, not eating very well, and that's certainly something that had an effect as well. She had a kind of breakdown, a mental breakdown. And she was incarcerated against her will in a facility that was using experimental drugs. In fact, a kind of drug that caused the effect of electroshock therapy in a chemical way. She wrote a memoir of this time, and that memoir, the memoir was written, was lost, was retold and written down and lost again, and then finally published. And it's called Down Below. And I just want to read a little bit from it for you. It begins, "Exactly 3 years ago, I was interned in Dr. Morales' sanatorium in Santander, Spain. Dr. Pardo of Madrid and the British consul having pronounced me incurably insane. Since I fortuitously met you, whom I consider the most clear-sighted of all, I began gathering a week ago the threads which might have led me across the initial border of knowledge. I must live through that experience all over again, because by doing so, I believe that I may be of use to you, just as I believe that you will be of help to me in my journey beyond that frontier, by keeping me lucid and by enabling me to put on and take off at will the mask which will be my shield against the hostility of conformism." And then she tells a little bit about the background of how she left France and tried to go to Spain. Let me jump ahead a little. "My first awakening to consciousness was painful. I thought that I was the victim of an automobile accident. The place was suggestive of a hospital, and I was watched by a repulsive-looking nurse who looked like an enormous bottle of Lysol. I was in pain, and I realized that my hands and feet were bound by leather straps. I learned later that I had entered the place fighting like a tigress, that on the evening of my arrival there, Don Mariano, the physician who was the head of the sanitarium, had tried to induce me to eat, and I had clawed him. He had slapped and strapped me down and compelled me to absorb food through tubes inserted into my nostrils. I don't remember anything about it." It's a compelling narrative and a really fascinating read. One of the things that struck me about it is her heightened senses. And, of course, one of the other passions of mine is deep listening, and that's another sort of the triad of things that will go into this show, is thinking about sound. sound that evokes noir, sound that evokes the surreal, and sound that offers a kind of listening experience that is something more than just, or something different from just sort of toe-tapping melodies. Surrealism, the term, was actually coined by the poet Guillaume Apollinaire to describe the music of Eric Satie. So the connection between surreal and music is well established. But I want to think about this in terms of deep listening, which is to connect to sound in a very different and deliberate way. So, of course, let me start with the godmother of deep listening, Pauline Oliveros. And that was from Ghostdance by Pauline Oliveros. The track is The Last Time, La Ultima Vez. Ghostdance was a music and dance collaboration between Pauline Oliveros and Paula Yossa Jones. It was commissioned by the Lincoln Center out of doors and released in 1998. Pauline Oliveros started deep listening as a form of meditation. As she says in her book of the same name, attention is directed to the interplay of sounds and silences, or the sound/silence continuum. Sound is not limited to musical or speaking sounds, but is inclusive of all perceptible vibrations or sonic formations. The relationship of all perceptible sounds is important. The practice is intended to expand consciousness to the whole space-time continuum of sound and silences. Deep listening is a process that extends the listener to this continuum, as well as to focus instantaneously on a single sound or engagement to targeted detail, or to sequences of sound and silence. In order to acquire the discipline and control that meditation develops, relaxation as well as concentration is essential. The practice of deep listening is intended to facilitate creativity in art and life through this form of meditation. Creativity means the formation of new patterns, exceeding the limitations and boundaries of old patterns, or using old patterns in new ways. Animals are deep listeners. When you enter an environment where there are birds, insects, or animals, they are listening to you completely. You are received. Your presence may be the difference between life and death for the creatures of the environment. Listening is survival. Sounds carry intelligence. Ideas, feelings, and memories are triggered by sounds. If you are too narrow in your awareness of sounds, you are likely to be disconnected from your environment. More often than not, urban living causes narrow focus and disconnection. Too much information is coming into the auditory cortex, or habit has narrowed listening to only what seems of value and concern to the listener. All else is tuned out or discarded as garbage. To offer you an opportunity for some deep listening to something unusual, I want to play a couple tracks from Musica Sveciae, For Nordiska Klanger, or the sounds of prehistoric Scandinavia. These are sounds made from the reconstructions of instruments from that time, or from the actual instruments that have been dug up in archaeological sites. These are primitive sounds in some ways, but these are deeply resonant sounds that I think you'll find interesting. The surrealists themselves were fascinated with the art of crime, not only for its shock value, which, like the dream imagery and dream narratives of their work, were a way of forcing people out of sort of normal everyday existence, but also crime itself as a kind of art. I recently picked up Jonathan Eburn's Surrealism and the Art of Crime, and I'm looking forward to diving into it a little more deeply, which I haven't had a chance to do yet. But what I have read already connects to this idea that the mystery inherent in crime, why people do what they do, what drives them to it, this kind of surreal logic that makes people believe that the only way to deal with their situation is through crime. But there's also the romance of crime, and one of the figures that he certainly mentions is the popular crime fiction persona in France, Fantomas, who is, this sort of dazzling kind of criminal with disguises and always eluding the pursuit by the police. So not just crime, but crime also as mystery, not in the sense of, say, Golden Age detective stories, where the mystery is something that must be unraveled and then put back together so that society can be restored, but as in noir, where the mystery is what you will do, and when you have done it, what will happen, and there is no resolution, that what happens afterward is uncertain. There are no happy endings in noir. If there's a happy ending, it's probably not really noir. But this familiarity with not just the genre of crime, but also the fictions of crime, and the popularity of the pulp writers, too, with the surrealist artists, and the garish kind of cover art that was on their books. Certainly it all had its attraction, too. And it's this kind of knowledge base, too. Going back to In a Lonely Place, one of the striking things about the novel is that Dick Steele, the protagonist, who's the serial killer, is also somebody who masquerades as a crime writer. There's a wonderful passage where he's talking with his friend Brub, who he had been with in the war and who has settled in Los Angeles and become a police investigator and is investigating the crimes that Dix has committed. And he and his wife are enjoying an evening at home with their friend, with his old friend, who shows a surprising amount of curiosity in these murders that have happened. In fact, Brub's wife, Sylvia, is a little concerned about his interest, but he finds a way to cover that up. Dick smiled into his drink. I'm different. I have a personal interest in the case. He let his eyes lift lazily as he spoke. Sylvia had been frozen where she stood, her eyes alone moving, her eyes slewing swiftly to his face, as if he'd suddenly revealed himself as the strangler. Brub went on swizzling. You see, I'm writing a detective novel, Dix added. Sylvia moved then, setting down the ashtray she held. It made a small clink on the glass-topped end table. Brub brought her the highball. Here you are, Skipper. He sat down, hanging his feet over the arm of the green chair. So that's what you're writing. Who are you stealing from? Chandler or Hammett or Gardner? Little of each, Dix agreed, with a touch of Queen and Carr. It should be a bestseller if you could combine all those, Sylvia said. She sat opposite Brub. Can't miss, Dix admitted. But for God's sake, don't tell Uncle Fergus what I'm doing. He thinks I'm writing literature. When he's with his old friend and his friend's wife, Dix is able to mask who he really is, at least for a time. The anger is always there beneath the surface, and he often thinks about how much he would enjoy strangling Sylvia. But it's there beneath his thoughts, and it's there in the memory that he can't get rid of, that drives him to what he does. So that's my segue to the next song. This is Sarah Angliss from Loom. And the song is Raven Memory. I'm coming to the end of my time, and I feel like I've barely begun to scratch the surface and probably haven't made very much sense. But I've at least given a taste of the kind of things to expect from this show, I hope. And I want to leave you with one final text before the final song. And this is a piece of automatic writing. The Surrealists were very big on automatic writing. You probably associate it more with the spiritualists and this kind of attempt to connect to the ether and to spirits beyond the veil. But the Surrealists, and again, there's some overlap with the with the spiritualists. Well, but more of that later. So this is a piece of automatic writing by Remedios Varo, who was born in Spain, lived in France, and then after the war also escaped to Mexico, like Leonora Carrington. And this text comes from the volume called Letters, Dreams, and Other Writings, translated by Margaret Carson, and it's just labeled Text 3 of the automatic writings. But it isn't so. Fallen feather, bird's feather, of course, and it's not even aware of those products to prevent baldness. Well, nothing is clear. 3 men, veiled in the secretive manner of those who must conceal themselves, because they know. But next to this knowledge, that it is not of the day-to-day, they haven't the slightest idea of the day-to-day, and no wonder. They fall into a manhole, carelessly left open in the middle of the street, because it was necessary to fix the sewers. Once down there and the veils dirtied, they had to abandon them. Walking, it's not quite that. Swimming. So did they arrive? Who knows? You hear at midnight to be classically black. Blackly humorous. An innocent life. Nothing to fear, neither pain nor guilt. The square meter surrounding it is entirely safe. But so many bees have come in and started making honey that's already almost a meter and reaches halfway up my body. I don't know what to do. If they keep on, I'll end up buried in honey. Adorable way to die. Let me thank you for listening. Thank NoBounds for taking me on. Thank Stephanie Johnson for my fabulous logo. And thanks to Eleni Poulou for bringing my attention to the call for new programs. So next and finally we have the late Kassia Flux with Song for After from her album Ergot in the Wine. Ergot, of course, being a fungus that often attacks plants, especially grains, and is at sometimes considered a possible cause of the behaviors that were dismissed as witchcraft. Well, it's a theory. Until next time.